Sacred Symbols, a PlayStation podcast, is brought to you by, well, you. If you want to learn how to support our show, go to patreon.com/laststandmedia. Greetings and salutations. Welcome back to Sacred Symbols Plus, a PlayStation podcast supplement. I am very pleased to welcome back one of our most important guests. I mean, someone that we used to have on all the time and is finally ready to come back. His name is Rick Hoeg. He's our legal analyst and, of course, a lawyer recovering from a stroke. So the whole audience knows about this because we've been giving a chronicle on Sacred Symbols, or were when you were at your worst, let's say. And so we are thrilled to have you back, my friend. Welcome.
I'm thrilled to be back. It's been a weird 3 months.
I know, I bet. Yeah. So can you catch everyone up in a very brief way about what's been going on with you and how you're doing?
Sure. So I had a stroke at the end of December last year, which came like a lightning bolt. Did not expect to do that, obviously. And then I was in the ICU for about a week until January 11th of this year. And then I was in inpatient rehab for a month. And I've been in outpatient rehab, meaning I can live at home and go to the hospital to do my rehab ever since. And I still have it scheduled through the end of May. So we've been working on getting my strength back. I had a right side hemorrhagic stroke, which means that my left side was impacted. So my hands and arms are still getting there. That's what we're rehabbing the most. But cognition was largely unaffected and speech is back. So we're here to talk about some fun stuff like Microsoft and the CMA and all sorts of things in between.
Indeed, man. You've been missed. And we said on our show, and I think I said to you, if not, I wasn't talking to you directly for a while. I was talking to your wife, who's awesome. And I was just saying like, we have a moratorium on legal analyses. We're not going to go. We always dance with the ones that brought us. We're going to talk about it on the show to the best we can, but we're going to wait until Hoeg is back and ready to give his analysis again. And so today is that day, my friend. And we are thrilled to have you back. And I'm knowing some people that have had strokes, and there are of course different types. I'm very impressed with your recovery, your speech, the way you look. I just want to congratulate you for that, because I know that takes a lot of hard work. And we were really, really pulling for you. And I know I said this a little bit on Ains's show as well, but at some point I was like, I should recede now. I've done what I could do, right? We tried to raise money. I was in constant conversation with your wife to update the show, and then I was like, now it's time to recede, like the Viet Cong into the brush.
Well, no, I really appreciate it. And my wife has told me how great you guys were in the immediate aftermath, and so many people came out to support. It was really nice to see. But yeah, it's been a long time, and I don't recommend anybody to go through this. Rehab is some of the hardest stuff I've ever done.
I bet, man. And we're going to continue to wish you the very best and take care of yourself. But we're thrilled to have you back here. And I'm also just thrilled to see you doing Hoeg Law again and just getting back. People have been so eager. It's not a great time to have you ride in the Pine Pony. Like we need you out there telling us things.
And everybody's been very nice about that too. But the DMs do go between, take it easy. You got to get your health and all that. And also, why aren't you commenting on this? Because there's 60 things that happened this week. It's like, yep, I know. I want to. I want to be out there doing more, but
I'm sure it's frustrating for you. What about one of the things I was talking to your wife about was gaming, because it's very cute and very decent, because she was really concerned about your ability to hold the controller. And I was trying to give her advice about mouse and keyboard and the things that we could do to try to circumvent that. The Leonardo controller was announced for PlayStation, for instance. But how's your ability to play?
Yeah, so a couple of people sent me adaptive controllers. I can play with the normal controller a little bit. I can't do action games, basically. I'm still working on thumb and forefinger control at the same time. And so that's been frustrating, because obviously gaming is one of my leisure activities. Mm-hmm. But we're getting there. It just takes a while. And my therapists don't want me to move all the way over to a substitute, because it's still useful for my brain to try to game. So
right.
Part of rehab is being frustrated all the time and hopefully getting a little bit better with the things you're frustrated at.
Good, man. That makes sense. And I'm happy to hear that. It seems like a good time. I don't know how you feel about turn-based games and JRPGs and stuff, but we could turn you into quite the weeb.
I love them. I mean,
great. So this is the time.
Octopath Traveler 2 has been my go-to game.
Good. That's exactly what I was going to say. That's so funny that you said that. Yeah. So it's a good time for you to catch up with some of these slower games, and then you'll have, when the time comes, you'll be ready to go with Resident Evil 4 and Dead Space and the things you might have missed, and you're gonna have a fucking one after the other. It's gonna be great. I'm looking forward to that.
That's the hope. I'm actually a lot better at moving people around 3D space now than I was in February. So we'll just keep trying.
Excellent. All right, my friend. Well, glad to have you here. You're very welcome here, always. And it's time to begin talking about the subject at hand. So we've tried our best to cover the Activision Blizzard stuff on Sacred Symbols. And I know the Dukes have done the same in a much deeper way because it affects their company a lot more. But I wanted to just kind of get your high level thoughts on what's going on here. Are we considering this a done deal now? Because I see people saying that, but I saw two things. One is that Sony responded, and so that could change decisions even more. And the second thing I read, which a lot of people seem to be ignoring, is that the FTC is almost certainly, as far as I can tell, going to have a problem with this. I was reading that the FTC is gearing up. It's actually a strange happenstance. My uncle on my dad's brother emails me sometimes stories from Substack or whatever. He's an old executive at FedEx, like a retired executive at FedEx, and he's really into all this shit. And he reads like that guy, Matt Stoller, and all these other dudes. And they were basically saying that the FTC is like gearing up, like hiring lawyers. They're going to become much more litigious, not only about Activision Blizzard, but get their teeth back that I guess they've not had for decades. I don't know if any of that's true. That's what I've read. I'm curious what your take is.
Sure. Well, the FTC's current stance under its chair, Lena Khan, is that their agency has not done enough to prevent bad mergers, to prevent bad corporate activities. And so she was actually appointed to that position with the notion that they would be more aggressive in enforcing their powers. And that has borne out in the last year and a half, although not to a great deal of success for the FTC, because the FTC didn't get new laws that authorized it to do new things. They're trying to reinterpret laws that had been looked at by the court system for the past 50, 100 years. And so, yes, I think they're gearing up in general. And you see news items like they got their own administrative law judge tried to stop them from blocking a deal in the healthcare industry, because that's where most of their merger looks happen, not in video games. But they overruled him and are going to try to block that Illumina Grail deal. But ultimately, for what we're looking at, that's one of the reasons they're a wild card, is that the Federal Trade Commission is out there saying, we're going to bring more litigations, we're going to fight more fights, whether we win or lose. And so part of what they're pushing for is to make Congress notice that they don't have enough power, according to them, and that the antitrust laws need to be reformed. So when people ask me, are they going to proceed with the Microsoft Activision deal, trying to block it, even though it's looking more and more like other jurisdictions are coming to the determination that there isn't much there, the answer is, well, they're people. You can't guess at what people are going to do, especially politically oriented people. And so will the FTC proceed with going down this road to potentially block the deal? I think every indication is that they probably will, even if it's a losing fight. But we can't know that for sure. That's guessing from whoever you hear it from, me or anybody else.
So since we haven't discussed this in so long, I am curious to kind of re-gauge where your mind is as far as the arguments. I mean, you said that there's no there. So I assume that this is kind of the way I think have felt for a while, that it's maybe a little flimsy. Are you still feeling that way? Is Sony, is the interpretation that Sony is fighting this simply because they can and they should, even though they have no hope of winning? Or I mean, what is your stance on all of this?
Well, I don't think they don't have any hope of winning, because I think that a regulator can do what a regulator does. Would that be the right thing historically or based on precedent and antitrust? No, it's not probably the strongest case we've ever seen. But I've thought that from the beginning. I said when I first analyzed the merger agreement that a regulator might have trouble with this because $70 billion is $70 billion, but that it's a very difficult thing to argue that they're actually manipulating a market of some kind. And so what the FTC and the CMA originally did was to change these markets into much smaller subsections of markets and say, Microsoft has too much power here and could have more power with Activision under its wing, especially foreclosing Call of Duty and things like that. But I always thought that was a fairly weak argument, because these markets that they have proposed, the market without Nintendo, the market for cloud gaming as separate from buying games, that kind of thing, they don't really exist in a way that we would consider an economic reality, right? So ultimately what happens is they can posit these things, but if they were tested in court, which is where they would have to go to actually get an injunction to block a deal, I would think that the courts would say, hey, the economics here doesn't dictate that you're actually looking at a monopolistic event. So when we talk about these things from a legal standpoint, I have argued that it's a fairly weak case. That doesn't mean that the FTC can't bring it It just doesn't mean that I think it's super likely to succeed.
Right. And by that point, they might have basically been given the green light by almost, they were given the green light in Japan, which I thought was pretty funny to do it. So that's an interesting insight. And I'm wondering, this might be a little bit of it's like not a gotcha question. It's kind of like a question you might not know the answer without researching it. But I'm wondering, is Sony's insistence that Call of Duty is irreplaceable, is that novel in some way? Like, is there any other example of a company saying this product cannot be replaced and will materially affect our company in this deleterious way? I mean, I'm trying to find, in other words, some sort of corollary to understand it, this argument through.
Yeah, the argument that they are making is one that we have seen for what we might call essential facilities or essential inputs. Usually, the way you think about this is that if you're in the semiconductor making market, or if you're in something that uses a specific kind of resource, if one of the parties were to buy all the silicon mines in the world, that would be a problem, right? Because that's an input that the competitor needs. It's a little bit weird in the video game context, but they're using the same kind of economic language. That's what both the FTC and the CMA have put together. They've taken this theory of inputs, actual things that you need to make your product, and have applied it to a Call of Duty or something, which is a kind of input to your ecosystem, but isn't the same kind of thing that we usually think of as required to actually function in that marketplace, right? That's the argument that you've seen. Sony has adopted that language and said, yes, Call of Duty is our silicon. We can't make silicon chips without silicon. We can't make video games without Call of Duty. And I think that's an inherently flimsy position because Nintendo exists. And so one of the things that the CMA and FTC had to try to do was to say Nintendo isn't in this market, that they're in a different market other than video game consoles, because everybody knows Nintendo exists. It's one of the things Brazil said first and foremost before we were looking at any other regulatory reports. Brazil had a whole section that said, look, you want to argue that you can't survive without Call of Duty, but Nintendo is sitting over here doing whatever it's doing with cardboard and everything else, doesn't have Call of Duty, and making it work. You know, the Switch is a very popular system. Yep. They competed on differentiation. They competed on mobile elements. They competed on one of the top tier first party studios in the world, but you can do it if you get your stuff together. And so the CMA and the FTC saw this, they knew this. I have a video where I was reading through the Brazil reports and said, this is one of the strongest arguments they make. And they said, well, Nintendo's not a part of this market anymore. We're going to say that there's only a high end console market and we don't have to consider Nintendo within it. And that led to some of the rest of this stuff. But I think at the end of the day, it's a weak argument to suggest that you need Call of Duty in order to have a successful video game console. Might you be less successful? Yes, that's what Sony's really worried about. You're going to lose money. You're going to lose market share. But ultimately, the regulators and the antitrust laws don't really care about the market share, or they shouldn't. They care about making sure that there's a market fight to be had.
Yeah, it's like, I'm not entirely sure I buy Sony's argument that Call of Duty is either irreplaceable or you can't attack it in any way. It's just a solid foundation that will always exist. And you and I talked about this before, but I just have a hard time wrapping my mind around Call of Duty still being this dominant force in 10 or 15 years. It just seems, it could be, but it's just so sad. Like, really?
Yeah, the history
This is how bad everyone is? I mean, and I'm not saying Call of Duty is bad. Call of Duty is awesome, but none of you can come up with anything.
Yeah. Well, and that's one of the problems they have is the history of video games is a history of having a dominant force and then it changing over the course of years, right? We're not so far removed from everybody looking for a Halo killer, right? I mean, that's not so many years ago where that was one of the leading ways to write articles and things like that.
Killzone.
Yeah. And they had Killzone and they had SOCOM and they ditched these properties. And if they put all their eggs in the Call of Duty basket, I'm not so sure they can just go ask the regulator to say, hey, we made mistakes for the last 10 years of our development pipeline. Sorry about that, but we need this to survive in video games. I don't think it makes a lot of sense. I don't believe them, but I will say this. When you're in these kind of litigation or litigation adjacent kind of situations, one thing that people I don't think get when you're on the internet or on Twitter is that, yes, there is an incentive and there is reasoning behind saying some of these more dramatic things like we can't survive without Call of Duty or some of the other things we saw from Sony's response to the CMA yesterday. And so you don't have to take what they're saying as 100% truth value. There is rhetorical reasons to make these arguments. And I think that gets lost in the wash somewhat. Do I love that? No, I don't love that a company whose products I've purchased a long time, PlayStation's 1 through 5 now, is out there making statements that I think are pretty patently absurd. But I can understand looking at the regulatory environment and seeing an FTC that wants to cut its teeth on somebody like Microsoft and saying, well, yeah, we'll give them the red meat. We'll let them go with this. Now, does that make a lot of sense in the long term? No, I will tell you just flat out. I feel less positive thoughts towards the Sony brand, the PlayStation brand, than I did before all this started.
Interesting. I wonder what the consensus is on that, because I think that a lot of people probably feel the same. One of the things I wanted to ask you, because we had that awesome episode, you and I, where we really got into the weeds on that one document. And I'd like to do that again with something else one day. But I was reading Sony's response, I guess their most recent retort, and I thought that there was something interesting in there. And I was curious what you make of it. When Harvey Smith from Arcane said that Redfall was on PS5 and then Microsoft came in and shut it down. When I read that, and that was reported by IGN, I want to say, which I read that and I was like, that was a mistake. And then lo and behold, it was in the document. And what I felt like was maybe the only salient thing left for Sony to kind of pull from, like the only dry powder they might have left, is to say, like, just so you know, they did the same thing with Bethesda. Like, here's an example of their own director saying that the game was on PS5 until they came in and took it away. And this was for something that was inconsequential, like Redfall, compared to a Call of Duty game. I think Redfall looks super awesome, to be perfectly honest. Is there anything there? Because I felt like I tracked that a little bit. I was like, I don't think you should have said that. And I'm sure that Pete Hines and those guys were on him like fucking white on rice after that interview. But nonetheless, they put it in their argument, in their counter argument. I don't know if it holds any weight. It might be like the last gasp, like a death throw. But what do you think?
I don't think it holds weight because I don't think that Redfall is a great analog to Call of Duty. And you see this being kind of discussed in the CMA documents and the FTC. And I think one of the issues that Sony has is they keep trying to equate what happened with Bethesda, and in particular Redfall and Starfield, with a continuing series that is decades old. And Microsoft keeps saying, no, Call of Duty is like Minecraft, which I also don't think is a great analog. So I'm not picking sides here. I don't think Sony has a great analog to Call of Duty. I don't think Minecraft is a great analog to Call of Duty either. But to me, Redfall wasn't on Sony. It was being developed for Sony and it stopped. Yes, that has a certain amount of logical cachet for, hey, this is what Microsoft did. But Microsoft, as far as I know, has never said in their documents that they weren't looking to potentially make exclusives for their product line. It doesn't make sense to spend billions of dollars to not do that. It just doesn't equate to a series that makes so much money on PlayStation and has had entries every year or almost every year for decades. So you say it's inconsequential as Redfall. I actually think that plays more towards Microsoft than Sony. It makes a ton of sense to me from an economic standpoint to say, yeah, if we've got a little thing that hasn't proven itself, we can make that exclusive to product differentiate, right? We're brand differentiating. You can only get Redfall over here, but we're not losing a ton of money because it is a small property. Call of Duty, by comparison, is a huge loss of money if you take it off of Sony. That's one of the reasons Sony is fighting so hard for it, is they say they make so much money from their 30%. But if you take it off of PlayStation, that's going to be a much higher opportunity cost than taking something like Redfall or Starfield, which continues to be hilariously referenced as like the Redfall franchise and the successful Starfield game from Bethesda. It's like, okay, guys, we don't have any idea whether Redfall or Starfield are going to be great games yet.
Right.
I want to believe, but who knows?
Right. It's interesting because with I guess Bethesda itself, I see Sony's corollary to something like Bungie, where it's like you bought this entity that kind of operates. And Minecraft might actually be more akin to that because you have your Destiny and you have your Minecraft and they float out there. But I think that there was an interesting gamesindustry.biz story that I actually talked about on Sacred Symbols just this last episode we did about monthly active users. Did you see this story, by the way? It's very interesting. It just went and showed 6 months worth of monthly active users from the 7 biggest games publishers, 2 first parties and 5 third parties.
No, I haven't read this one.
And Sony's number is floating somewhere around like 5 or 6% of the monthly active users on consoles playing their games. And a lot of that is Destiny. So you can tell that
their base game type is not live service.
Right, exactly.
It's not an MAU focused game.
Right, exactly. And so I guess my argument would be, and it's not really my argument, but they could look at Redfall and say like Redfall would be more of a game as a service than we have ever published since probably the PS3 era when we did SOCOM and MAG, and stuff like that. So there is something there, but that gets too into the weeds for regulators. And I just think it's fairly clear Sony's on their back foot now, and this deal is probably going to happen. Although I imagine, and I want to talk to you in a little while, that there's still going to be concessions.
Yeah, I would say so.
This is something we talked about on Sacred Symbols, and it's been cut and circulated. My theory that this must give a green light to Sony to buy whatever it wants. I'm wondering if you feel the same, and if they would go under the same regulatory scrutiny for attempted purchases that they might make. Because
ideally the scrutiny is the same, but that doesn't mean they don't get it passed.
So do you agree with the idea that they have a green light now? I mean, this is not so much of a legal question as opposed to just an analysis, but
yeah, I mean, I would say Sony, because it has so much less cash than Microsoft, is always looking at deals that are more likely to go through. We don't like to just make it a top line cash item type thing for regulators, but at least to some level, they're still human beings. And you see $70 billion compared to $7 billion, that's a different thing. You say that's more likely to possibly affect a market than just a smaller deal. And so Sony's dealing with less cash. They are making smaller ripples, smaller waves when they make a purchase, just by the very nature of the thing. So yeah, I think they'll still face regulatory scrutiny. Is it a green light? Yes, but they're not looking at $70 billion deals anyway.
Right. That's a good point. Yeah, because I think people are talking a lot about Sony's limited by cash flow, which I would disagree with, because I think they can leverage their company to finance any acquisition they really wanted up to a certain degree.
They could, but that's aggression, right? I mean, they're a conservative company as well. They stay within their liquidation.
That's, I guess, well, let's talk about this because, and again, it gets a little bit away from the legal question, but I am curious, do you think Sony is in some sort of imperative position now that they have to consolidate what they can? I mean, it seems when Activision Blizzard is taken off the board, not their games, because I don't think I've said I don't think the games are going anywhere, any of them, to be perfectly honest with you, but even the big ones, it doesn't matter. Diablo and all that kind of stuff, obviously Call of Duty, but does Sony, my argument was that, and it's not so much an argument, I guess I could see something like Sony looking at their situation saying, we don't really have the money or even the leverage to buy EA or Take-Two, right? Or something like that. Do they look around themselves in Japan and say, why don't we basically just make a consortium? I mean, so we can just gobble up 2 or 3 of the 4 major publishers there, and Square Enix, Capcom, Tecmo Koei, Bandai Namco. So I'm wondering how you think Sony might respond.
Well, I've long said since the start of this generation, where it looked like Microsoft was going to do some different things from Sony, that they can't just get into a money cannon fight with Microsoft. So I don't know exactly what the right business strategy is for them. I'd said at the time that they had to get weird, that they had to do different things than just trying to gobble up companies, because they just didn't have the dry powder to really run that fight against a company like Microsoft. But could they do something like an alliance in Japan? Maybe, although that brings into play the letters you're seeing from like the trade negotiations between the US and Japan already. So there are indications from certain folks in Congress that they don't much care for what's happening with respect to Sony in Japan, which ignores, again, Nintendo's existence. And we can talk about how silly that is. But it is worth noting that it's happening, because Sony has to at least be aware that that's occurring if they don't want to get pressure from their own country. So how do they respond to this? I think they should keep doing what they're doing, honestly, which is picking up the companies that they have a relationship with, or with people that they have a relationship with, and getting them early, right? What we see is they're trying to get small companies that maybe haven't done anything yet and get them for what would eventually be a discount if they play out. It's almost a venture capital kind of model. Mm-hmm. We buy 10 companies, 9 fail, but if one succeeds at a Destiny type level, we've all won. And to go at that, rather than buying Activision, which has proven itself for decades, and do what Microsoft is doing, which is buying these gorillas, you just go and you buy these things before they become gorillas, and you take a kind of growth equity strategy, would be my guess if I were Sony. But I don't know if they're going to be aggressive enough, because they've been caught flat-footed on the one thing that's probably the most important this generation, which is that we didn't quite know when the inflection point would be, but we knew Microsoft was going in a service orientation. They went with a walled garden again for another generation, and that appears to be the losing position right this second. We don't know, because the economics haven't been borne out all the way. But they're worried. Clearly, I think you're seeing a kind of dramatic flailing at this particular deal because they're worried about what a service in Xbox and Game Pass and being everywhere outside of the console space is going to do to their particular position. I think that's why you see them adopting a PC position, but it all feels like they're kind of responding rather than leading, even though they have the market leader position in so many jurisdictions. So I don't know. I love Sony for a long time. I hope they can find their footing and find the place that makes them happy and makes them money and has them live for a long time. But right this second, it does constantly feel to me like they're reacting to headwinds and exactly what's happening from their competitors rather than finding their own path.
Sony has long been a responder of in the gaming space as opposed to a leader. Literally the only place Sony has been a leader is in AAA storytelling, which is a huge thing. But when you think about them being brought kicking and screaming, look at the PS2 and the Xbox, the original Xbox, and how different they are. And then look at the Xbox 360 and the PS3. Which of those consoles were like what? PS2 is the last of its kind, basically, while the Xbox was the beginning of something. And so whether it's with metagaming, online gaming, online storefronts, all of that, Microsoft was first. And they are first to the Game Pass style thing as well. Again, it's not about, the show has nothing to do with it. I am deeply worried about the economics of that and like what that means for games. And I really caution people embracing it.
No, I get that. I've said that to folks on my channel as well, which is that it's too much of a black box for us to know whether this is making developers enough money or whether they're making the right calls. And that's all math on a piece of paper somewhere. So it's their offer that's accepted by a developer, but we don't know whether that's sustainable long term. And even though Xbox might make money on it in short-term bursts, or they say that they're revenue positive or neutral, it's very difficult to say for certain that that is a model that's going to work long term. So I agree with you that it's still a little bit opaque to us on the outside, and they don't report it as something that can be evaluated by anybody on the outside because it's all kind of combined in their services numbers. So we'll have to see. Sony is adamant about the fact that you couldn't possibly do day one releases like that and make the economics work. So we'll see long term. I don't want to see gaming go in a bad direction. And people keep saying on my channel that I'm an Xbox fan. I'm a fan of deal making, and I'm a fan of regulators following the rules prescribed to them. So I'm a fan of the deal going through because I think it's 95% of the time outside of this particular regulatory environment, you would have had this go through and nobody would have talked about it. This is not a terribly challenging deal in my estimation. But
and you would know. I mean, this is your whole space, right? I mean, and
well, I'm not doing $70 billion deals very often.
But you're an M&A lawyer, right? I mean, that's
Yes, I've done a number of mergers and acquisitions, and I've dealt with regulatory filings. Absolutely.
So this is your space. So you would know. I mean, this is why we come to you for this level of expertise, which we appreciate. And I am so fascinated, Rick, by the data Sony must be getting and how they probably have to ignore a lot of it to understand that it could possibly not always be this way. So what I mean by this is God of War Ragnarok makes, I don't know, $1 billion or something like that for the company. I mean, sells 20 million copies, more than games ever sell, except for maybe in the Nintendo ecosystem. And they look at that and they're like, holy fucking shit. Look at all the money we just made. We just made 4 times our investment or whatever it is. Santa Monica is now can make 2 different games or whatever. And then the PS5 is just murdering, just absolutely murdering. It's up all of this like 150% year over year or something because it's finally flowing and people can find one. But they probably have to realize that that's not beyond their nose, that what's beyond is something very, like you said, a questionable situation, black box situation where you really don't know and everything looks really good right now. In other words, I kind of respect the fact that they're not being like, we're fucking awesome, which they're not doing. Instead they're just kind of silently winning, realizing that, and they really do feel like the tables are turning. That's the one thing I think about all of this. And kind of they know they're not stupid. They know that they're going to take some sort of public hit, reputational hit. People are going to talk about this, make fun of all of this kind of stuff. It's going to make them look weak. That they were willing to do all of that anyway shows that they're scared. And I don't think that can be ignored.
Yeah, I think I described it as flailing. I think there is a certain amount of desperation that comes across from what they're doing that suggests that they are serious about this being a significant impact on their bottom line. Will they die? Will all of gaming die if Call of Duty goes to one particular party? I don't think so, but it's clear that they are concerned at a fundamental level. I would also argue that they shouldn't have put themselves in this position if that's where the math turns out, but I think they just never thought Activision could be purchased.
Yeah, I agree. And I was wondering for a time if the remedy, the proposed remedy of spinning Call of Duty off would have been like some sort of thing that would have solved it. But then Microsoft made it clear that they weren't interested, nor should they be interested in having that happen. I mean, that would be the major thing that you were taking on. But
well, and the way Activision has built itself over the last 5 or 10 years is that every studio is so ingrained in the process of making Call of Duty that I don't know that you could spin it off without spinning off all of Activision. Unless you're going to separate the A from the B and the K, I don't think that you can just spin off Call of Duty with the same kind of ease that you might be able to spin off some other game companies, other products.
Talk to me a little bit about the scrutiny that you had mentioned earlier about the U.S. government looking into Sony and unfair trade practices with the trade representatives from Japan.
Sure.
This is obviously an unfortunate unintended consequence of Sony's really serious attempts to try to take this deal down. And some people were making fun of the idea of these congressmen writing these letters and everything, but then you see it's like the congressman from Microsoft's district and the congressman from Nintendo's district and all these different places. And it's what you would expect of them to do. Is there anything here that should be worried about? Because I look at this and I'm like, I don't think this even matters.
I think it's politics for the most part. It's bloviating. And I think if there's anything to take away from it, it is the understanding that if a politician or a regulatory body has a statistic that they can use to try to argue their point, many of them are willing to use it regardless of whether or not it bears a relationship to reality, right? Because like the one thing we keep seeing from these letters is that, Sony has a 98% share of the video game market in Japan, and Japan is backing it up as a government, and so that we need to attack them through our treaty and trade organization processes. And it's like, well, Sony definitely doesn't have 98% of the video game industry in Japan. You have to pretend Nintendo doesn't exist, a very Japanese company that has a lot of the Japanese market. And that doesn't make any sense, except if you take this kind of high-end market concept as real, which isn't real. And the FTC and CMA kind of invented it so that they could argue that Sony had undue market power, or that Microsoft had undue market power in this specific market. But now you see it being used in this particular context. And I think some people like to see a certain amount of hoisted on your own petard in the internet space. I don't really think Sony did that. I think Sony was arguing pretty adamantly to the regulatory bodies, but I always sit back and say the regulatory bodies had to buy it, right? Sony gave them a hook to hang their hat on, but Sony made an argument. Sony didn't establish this market. CMA and FTC had to do that in order for them to get to this letter point. Should Sony have done that? I think when I looked at these things last November and said Sony advancing to this deal must not be allowed or the gaming industry will fold, that was a significant advancement. And I think what we've been seeing since then is essentially that they're pot committed, right? That they have pushed all their chips in on this, the deal must die. And so they are making any statement that kind of backs that up. And yes, that comes across sometimes with Congress people that, I'll just be gentle here, don't have reasons to know the intricacies of every specific industry in the world. And so they take data that they get and 98% looks good and they put it out in a letter. And the rest of us that follow these things a little bit more closely on an individual industry level can say that's ridiculous and laugh at it. But will Japan do anything? Because it's a set of letters that are designed to pressure the country of Japan. No, I wouldn't think so. If I were Japan, I'd look at that and laugh. I'd say, yeah, no, that's not a real statistic. Sorry.
Could Microsoft reasonably purchase more after this, or is this the end of their ability to purchase?
Well, they'll be in the spotlight after this, but yeah, I think they have designs on purchasing more. Is it going to be anything of this size? I don't think there's anything to buy of this size, but
if they went after like a Take-Two or an EA, would there be a problem?
Well, those are significantly smaller entities,
right.
But no, I don't think that there would be a problem. They would have this regulatory process go through, and I think probably I wouldn't have to make the video this time that says when they sign a deal, it's closed from some of the headlines. I wouldn't have to make that correction because I think people would understand now going through all this that company is not purchased until you go through all of the hoops and bells and whistles and everything else. But do I think they're going to buy more? Yeah, I would suspect so.
It's interesting because my read of it, layman's read, was that once this deal was made, it would look weird for them to continue to just gobble things up when they were making the argument that they needed this biggest thing so badly that they went through all of these hoops or whatever and fought and defended it and did it. And now they're going after much smaller entities too. And that seems to be more monopolistic in some way, to go after big publishers. People who understand what the games industry knows that if you have Activision and say EA and Ubisoft, you basically control that does seem to be, maybe it's a misnomer, but monopolistic in some way.
Well, I mean, I think anybody could look at buying up somebody like an Electronic Arts and an Ubisoft as taking steps to consolidate the industry. Is it monopolistic? It would depend on what they did with them, right? That's why we're having all these fights about whether the incentive is to take Call of Duty off of PlayStation or not. And Microsoft saying, no, that math doesn't make any sense. And Sony saying, no, it definitely makes sense. That's part of the important fights, is that you can have another company, you can spend your money, you have this cash, you earned it. And we're only going to get in the way and try to stop you if you're going to do something that restrains trade or has unfair competition as a result of it. So could they buy a company that size? Yes, perhaps, although it's important to note that you need two to tango. You can't just force your will on people, generally speaking. Ubisoft itself has survived a number of hostile takeover attempts at this point. So I think it may be a little bit dramatic to say that they're definitely going to go that direction. I see them purchasing more specific, smaller companies, more like Sony buying Bungie than buying huge publishers with multiple franchises and things like that. And I do think if you did try to buy a giant company that had huge franchises, if we were talking about EA, they'd be talking about FIFA and sports and things like that. If they tried to buy Ubisoft, we'd have a lot of Assassin's Creed discussions. I don't think that's probably the wisest way to spend your time or money if you're Microsoft next. But understand, Microsoft has a huge amount of cash in general and a huge amount of liquidity always. And we're in an environment where letting your money sit there in the bank isn't the greatest idea. So they're trying to gobble up assets that they can have appreciate over time. And so what they do with that is going to depend on what they want their aggression to look like in the future. And from a game perspective, I agree with everybody that says, well, we don't know if Microsoft can actually use these things too terribly well. I sit back and say, hey, I want to see them actually have success with first parties more. But from a legal perspective, I also say they should be allowed to make these purchases if they want to make them.
Yeah, to me, on a personal level, this is the reason I resent this deal, is because it just seems like it's a harbinger of things to come. And
Sure.
A Microsoft that buys Activision doesn't really bother me too much as an individual player in my myopic point of view. Like, I don't play Activision games at all. I don't care. It doesn't. It worked out really well with me for Bethesda too, as I've lamented many times in the past. Like, I'm gonna miss machine games and a few other things, but whatever. But the further they encroach into the industry and the more they gobble up, the more I'm going to resent that they're doing this to the status quo, and that it is obviously being done because it's the only way they can win. And that's not a legal argument. So
I think you see that on the internet. I think you see a certain amount of kind of, this is unfair, tossed at this deal and tossed at what Microsoft is doing, which is, they didn't make their hay in video games. This is money from operating systems and things like that. And they've got this huge treasure chest that they're using to buy their way into a position they didn't earn. But honestly, a lot of industries are organized that way and they turn out just fine. I think everybody that's a gamer should be hoping that Microsoft succeeds with the assets that it has, because frankly, it has so many. To not succeed could potentially do significant damage to intellectual properties that you care about a lot.
And that connects to my feelings that we talk about Starfield and why I just feel positive that Starfield is going to be excellent, because it is so vital to proving what you just said, which is that you gobble up assets and let them do really good work. They have to deliver the goods, right? And then it's as if nothing really changed and you still get your creative output. So the non-legal argument I just made is kind of satisfied. And that's why I find that the skepticism around that game so funny, because if that game is anything less than great, then I would say Xbox is in serious trouble as far as its ability to navigate these waters, because that will just double down and triple down on the whole, like you're buying things and you can't even control them.
Well, I'm skeptical, but I mean, that's historically, you look at this and you see they tried to launch their new console with Halo, and like they completely biffed that entire time frame. That is not what you would want to see from your keystone intellectual property at the company. So if they can do that with Halo, I look and say, I am concerned that they could do that with absolutely anything. On the flip side of that coin, Bethesda has been working on Starfield for a number of years before they were even approached by Microsoft. So do I have hope for it? Yes, it's a Bethesda open world RPG. You would hope that it would turn out like Skyrim or something like that, but I've not been impressed by the trailers so far. I've not been impressed by the game experience they have so far shown. Can that change by the end of the year? Absolutely. I didn't think I'd be too deeply into Diablo 4, and I thought that beta was fantastic.
Oh, nice. I'm glad you played that. Yeah, Diablo is not my thing. It goes back to Activision Blizzard, where I'm like, I couldn't care less that the stuff would be going away if it was, but it's not going to actually be going away. But it's funny because I look at Microsoft's moves and it's like Occam's razor with Bethesda. They have to know how important that game is. I would argue it's one of the most important game releases in the moment it's happening ever, because of its proof of the pudding kind of situation where it's going to either be this big turning point or a reiteration and a confirmation of what a lot of people believe. And I think that everyone knows that. Like, I think they would sooner not cancel, delay it again than release a bad game, because they know. They just have to know. That's like an Occam's razor thing where I'm like, I bet you Starfield's gonna be awesome. Just because.
Well, to Microsoft's credit, they have done that, right? The Halo move was to pull it out of a console launch window. I don't think we've ever seen that before, and to give it another year. So if Starfield has a showing, like say this summer, that just isn't what they want it to be, they might do the same thing. I hope it's great. Everybody that's looking at this, I want to say, should hope that Microsoft can succeed with this, because they do have all those eggs in that basket now. So you should want them to succeed if you love playing great games. That's not a Sony or Microsoft thing. That's just, I'm a gamer and I would like to play some great games. So go knock it out of the park, Microsoft.
We had already kind of talked a little bit about this, so we don't have to linger on it. But what do you think Sony's logical steps would be? Just from a because you had brought up a good point. I'm a study of PlayStation. I've been covering them professionally for a long time, so I know the nature and tenor of their old deals and how that has evolved into something else. And I would argue that it was completely organic in the beginning. They were insistent on working with studios first and bringing them in after one or two games, whether it was Guerrilla or even studios that they shut down like Evolution, all the way through to Sucker Punch and so on. And then I think post Bethesda, they started making moves that were still sensical in some way, but were, like you said, trying to get to that point sooner. So purchasing Haven was a good example of that, where they must just be like, well, let's just get these guys.
Yeah,
not even wait. Anything. Right.
Yeah.
Like not even let them be available and so on and so forth. They go after Nix's and Valkyrie to get help on PC ports and staffing on art and animations and all of those kinds of things. And I fear that after this, as I said, the next step would be for them to start making deals that just don't make sense. Because I will argue that although Activision Blizzard is a deal that feeds Game Pass, I still don't think it's a deal that makes very much sense. I don't think there's an A and B fit there. I think Microsoft just went after the brute force biggest fucking company that they can possibly get because they needed it and they wanted it. I don't think there was any sophistication beyond that.
It was a fire sale. I mean, if you remember, Activision was in the middle of the California litigation. They still are, but their stock price had depreciated so much that they came in. Bobby Kotick said, "Here's the number," and they bought him. I mean, the description of that particular negotiation at the end of that year is hilarious, because it's just, well, your number is way down. We're willing to buy you. What's your number? And they just picked a number out of the sky, and then they said, well, yeah, let's buy Activision. So I mean, that's one of the lawsuits, is the shareholders saying Activision didn't do a good job negotiating for itself. But I think if I'm Sony, I'm probably looking to consolidate a little bit more, not so much to fight Microsoft, but to just make sure that I'm not foreclosed, to use a loaded word at this point, from talent or institutional knowledge that could really help me, right? The Bungie purchases for live services. Microsoft has said time and time again that the Activision purchase is really for mobile. So Sony would analyze what it thinks it needs in the video game space and buy companies that could help fill those gaps. I do see them doing that.
How do you think this all goes down with Microsoft? What do you think the concessions are? Do you think there are concessions, or do you think that Sony just lets it ride? Because they've refused to they refuse to sign anything. My assumption is that Microsoft might not have to offer them anything now, right? I mean, it wasn't that part of the risk of
that is part of the risk.
Yeah, of like flying too close to the sun. So, I mean, could Microsoft just say like, no, fuck it. We're going to publish on PlayStation for the foreseeable future, but we're not giving you a deal anymore. I assume that that's something they can do. Would that be a little aggro, though? I feel like Microsoft might want to be a little more conciliatory than that.
Yeah, Microsoft has evidenced a strategic desire to be that kind of white knight. Now, you don't have to believe them, right? They're a corporate actor just like anybody else, but that's the stance they like to present to the world right now. So I don't think that they would do anything overly aggressive as a result of the concessions. But I think they've signaled what concessions they're willing to give, such as making sure that Call of Duty arrives on these various platforms. And if they want to ask for other properties, I'm sure that they would listen to these things. What I would expect is that Microsoft is in a pretty strong position, I would say. And so the concessions would largely reflect what they have presented for the last 18 months as being things they are willing to do, right? Those are concessions. They're legally mandated, but I tend to refer to them as swim lanes. If the swim lanes are still where you wanted to swim anyway, they're not really a big demotivator for getting your deal done. So I think Microsoft has tried to share with the world what it's willing to give on this. And if that's as part of a contract, I think they're fine with it. So I think it's probably related to access to video games. It might also be related to, I would say, pricing of Game Pass and things like that. Access to those as well. But I don't know that a lot of concessions make a ton of sense. I wouldn't expect a divestiture. I wouldn't expect a spinoff. I would expect only behavioral remedies, as the saying goes, that relate to what they're going to do with the assets afterwards. And I would expect them to largely reflect what Microsoft has already suggested it's willing to do in its press releases. So I do see Microsoft very likely coming out with a almost complete win on this in the long term. But God, it's taken them a lot of time and money and paid a lot of lawyers.
Yeah. The only thing is Sony did the same, right? So it's like, and they lost. So there's it's not even Pyrrhic. It's just the Sony lost this argument. And I think it's reasonable enough. I don't think they made a very compelling argument because I don't like the idea that, again, Call of Duty is just this insurmountable product. I just don't think gaming plays that out. Things come and go. I mean, even when you look at Nintendo, we were just talking about Switch's success. Switch is on a trajectory to be the best-selling gaming device ever. And if it doesn't get there, it's going to sputter out just short. But it's already past PS4, so now it's in that space where it's starting to come up on PS2 and so on, and DS and all of that. And I look at that and I'm like, well, last generation, the Wii U bombed. Anything can happen. Nintendo looked like they were done as far as a hardware competitor after a Wii U and even a little bit after 3DS, and they turned 3DS around as well. So I wasn't compelled by that because I just don't think the history of gaming bears that out.
Right. But there's a dynamism there that you want to be very careful about kind of interfering with and expecting that the same thing that exists right this second exists in 10 years from now, because that's just not what the industry has done.
What I would do, I mean, and this is a very aggressive move that I have no knowledge of Sony's books and how much they really do rely on Call of Duty money or whatever. But here's my analysis, and I'm curious what you think of this. Is that until 2024, they have a marketing deal, so they're going to have to spend some money on Call of Duty. But after that, the Call of Duty situation is basically, I wouldn't say it's free money. They don't publish it. They're not paying for it anymore. It's being sold on their console, and they're getting their 30% rip. One of the things Microsoft offered Sony in this deal, and I think Microsoft was offering this when they were a little more desperate, I think when things were looking a little bit worse for them, was they're like, we'll give it to you for use on PlayStation Plus. And if I were Sony, I would do the most aggressive thing you can possibly do, which would be like, okay. And then, so 2025, the marketing deal's over. Call of Duty's on the lowest tier of PlayStation Plus for everyone. And I think that would be like one of the most aggressive things you can possibly do, way cheaper than Game Pass. You're sacrificing your 30% rips, but that's not money and that's money you're obviously calculating for, but you're not earning it because you're not spending it. So sacrifice it and fight back. It's like a very blown out example. It would be a very blown out response compared to, let's say, putting MLB The Show on Game Pass, which was a major aggressive move and an insult, right? That they did that. And they did that because they were like, well, we don't make the game anyway. Who gives a shit? And I wonder, do you think that would be a move that would be possible? I think that would be a massive coup for Sony to do something like that, to basically just say, like, if you have PlayStation Plus,
Well, the thing is, we still don't know the economics, right? One of the Sony's complaints about that PlayStation Plus offer is that Microsoft had asked for something that really drove Sony crazy and said that we couldn't even sell PlayStation Plus if we put it on the service. So the one thing I don't think you're taking into account is that if they put it on PlayStation Plus, there's going to be some economic payment happening from Sony to Microsoft.
Right, some license fee.
For downloads or plays or whatever the actual calculation would be based on. So Sony would have to pay money to put it on that. And hopefully you'd be doing it to cannibalize Call of Duty sales on your competitor / moving from ecosystem to ecosystem. So it would just depend on math, right? This is all PowerPoint presentation somewhere. How many people do you think you can hold? How much will it cost us? Does that make sense per head, right?
Yeah.
And so I don't know that it will, based on what Sony has said, based on what I would expect from an agreement like that on a subscription service. So I don't know that we will see it that way, but I do think it makes sense for Sony to start looking at these things as actual competitions rather than just kind of going in their own direction or saying bad things to the FTC or the CMA.
Right. And you make, I guess I was insinuating that Sony would have to pay, just like they pay for all of their licensures, but that, yeah, the cost of it, it's very similar to what Microsoft or what Sony did with Ghostwire Tokyo and what was the other one? Why can't I think of it? Deathloop, where the day that they were available on Xbox, they just put them on PlayStation Plus, and obviously they're paying for that, but there is some sort of, counter competitive reason. Yeah. It would be worth eating it in some way to just make PlayStation, to just blow. It would be so funny to blow up PlayStation Plus Essential into like this massive thing just by this one move. But you're right. There was a redaction in that report where Sony was like, this is what they're asking for per game. And that's ridiculous. So There is that too. And there's no doubt about it.
We got to see the argument where they're like, this would kill the whole service. We'd have to charge too much money. And we just don't know what the specifics are there. Because generally speaking, if you've read these documents, we don't get to see the specifics. You get to see kind of the aftermath. It's like trying to look at a negative of a photo and remember what it is.
It's so interesting though, because and Microsoft would have to agree to doing a one-off PlayStation Plus thing, like the free game of the month sort of thing. If you just cleared the schedule, again, I'm just spitballing, like you clear the schedule in November and it's just Call of Duty for free. And even if Sony had to pay $100 or $150 million in license on that, that's a fraction of their quarterly profit. You would just think that would be like, I don't know, be aggressive.
PowerPoint would just have to say what you got from it, right? Mm-hmm. You'd have to argue these people will stay that would have left, and that's worth it for this expenditure. I mean, like that's how these things work. So would that happen? I don't know. I would doubt it, but it's
I doubt it too. I just don't know how you can eschew that much free money. It's hard. It's hard to make that argument for the sure thing. You got the sure thing, but I think PlayStation's path to fighting Xbox or continuing to fight Xbox is to undercut Game Pass as much as possible. And Microsoft is doing that to a degree themselves because they're inevitably having, and they've shut down the $1 a month spigot that's been abused to fucking the ends of the earth. They have the family plan that's more expensive than people thought it was going to be, all these things. And it's like prices are definitely going to go up. So continuing to draw people away from Game Pass might be their best path forward if they're really truly scared of it. But then you see things like God of War, and this is the point I'm making, Hoeg. You see something like God of War and it's like, damn, Sony probably looks at that and they're like, well, what? We're just getting evidence that it doesn't matter, over and over again. Hogwarts Legacy, Dead Space Remake, Resident Evil 4. People are buying these games over the millions and millions and millions, except for on Xbox, because a lot of people don't buy games on Xbox anymore, which is, a sad situation, which is why I'm afraid of the economics of games, but nonetheless.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think the worst effect on me from something like Game Pass is that I think 5 times before buying like an indie game because I'm worried it's going to be free tomorrow on a service like Game Pass. So I do go through that process, but I think overall we're going to hit a period of stability. Whether that looks like how you want it to look like or how I want it to look like is an open question. But I think we're going to see some more consolidation, and we're going to see game companies making games, hopefully, and get back to the business of not having so much business. Just out of curiosity, what would your ideal turnout of what would the new status quo be? Honestly, I don't mind the one walled garden, the one crazy console developer, and the one services company. I think that's a pretty good menu of options for how you want to purchase your video games. I would love to see regulators realize that they're all substitutes for each other, but I don't really mind what was going into this generation as the status quo. Your wacky uncle with his cardboard houses that you attach to your system, the one kind of standard, this is how we've always done it, walled garden in Sony, and then Microsoft saying, we don't actually care if you buy an Xbox ever again. We're just going to make services and you play them wherever you want. I think those are good options for getting more video games into more people's hands. Now, I continue to worry about live service just kind of taking over everything because the opportunity cost of not making a live service game, I think, continues to increase for these companies that see the huge successes and kind of ignore putting in all of the failures to the calculation of whether they should move into live services. Sony has made now AAA cinematic action adventures their bread and butter, but I would like to see them have more variety outside of that without going just into making Destiny type clones. So PlayStation 2, I think I've said this to you before, Colin, but PlayStation 2 era was one of my favorites because there was so much variety and so much weirdness that was coming out all the time.
Mm-hmm.
I know games cost more to make because you're making so many photorealistic textures and spending more on just huge amounts of people and voice acting and everything else, but I would love to see more of that variety return, however that looks. One of the reasons I love Game Pass is not for day one AAA games, because Microsoft, unfortunately, has not been able to keep that pipeline going to the extent that I would like it, and I think a lot of people would like it. But it has been a great indie game sample platter. You go on there every couple of weeks and you just look at the first 8 games and say, I'll try those. And I found some gems that I've really enjoyed from that process. So that gives me that kind of variety feel, the novelty feel that I remember loving from video games way back when. So I would love to see that continue on without eviscerating narrative and storytelling like I fear might come if everybody just goes live action or subscription service.
I'm glad that you bring up that generation because it does go to show you how consistent their ideologies have been in some way. You know, the PS2 was always Sony power, sophistication, electronics. You know, Microsoft has really always embraced like the online box. And GameCube
Xbox Arcade was a big deal,
right? Yeah, exactly. And GameCube, it was a strain. They're like, we have mini discs, and then Wii and the Wii U and all these things. So they've always retained these identities. So you're absolutely right that because my answer to that with the status quo is, it is good. Everything works right now. I am afraid that one of these isolated instances, as they were, is going to start encroaching on the other and deeply affecting the economics of the other unfairly. And what I mean by unfairly is that it's as you said, and this is why I think it's so important to understand what Xbox is making as a unit and not Microsoft itself, because spending money from something else and making a new reality is not naturalistic. And it happens, like you said, all the time. It's not fair. I mean, it happens, but it sucks. And I'm going to call it what it is. It sucks. And so if that's what's going to happen, is that we're never really going to know the economics and the money is just going to continue to pour in and make it so, fuck that. I don't think that doesn't benefit anyone. And I think it's a bummer. So I'm like, I don't mind having all these subscription services. That's totally cool. But as long as a la carte game purchases remain viable and people can make money that way, I think it's important to look at games as investments like that. They're not, it's not music. It's not Spotify, because bands don't make money on music anyway. They make money in other ways. They make money touring and doing all that kind of stuff. There is no second option in video games. I don't think people think about that with all this stuff. When you're I don't know. I'm just going on and on. All right. Let me see here. Let's get into the Chris Avellone thing. I wanted to kind of just talk about what happened with Chris Avellone just as a quick postscript before we get out of here.
Sure.
For people that don't know, Chris Avellone is a famous games writer, wrote Fallout New Vegas, and he did a bunch of stuff like Icewind Dale and Baldur's Gate. I mean, he's more famous in the PC space, but in 2020, he was defamed, or I guess he was, well, I don't want to say at that time he was defamed. He was accused of sexual impropriety by these 2 different women who made some very specific claims, including calling him a sexual predator who should be removed from the industry. And Chris Avellone, to his credit, and we reported on this at the time, and I don't know if we actually did a show on him or not. I don't remember. Do you remember? Did we ever talk about him on one of our shows? I don't think so.
We did. I did a video on Virtual Legality.
Yeah, of course you did on Virtual Legality over on YouTube. But yeah, I don't know if we ever gathered to talk about him as as we sometimes do when legal issues come up. But this had kind of been percolating in the background because he filed suit, things got quiet, and so on and so forth. But then out of nowhere, Friday news dump last week, he posts a medium, like a small medium post with, I guess, basically a statement from the two women that he sued saying they lied. And
retracting their statements, yeah.
Right. And that they and with also the realization of a 7-figure judgment. Now, that could mean 1 million or 1.1 million. That could mean 9.9 million. I don't know, but probably something towards the lower end. But I was just surprised by this because, as I understand, Hoeg, that's a really tough thing to prove out. Right now, they didn't go to court, I guess, fully and go before a jury. It was settled. But that's a sign, right, that they were going to lose. I mean, or that they felt they were going to lose. Otherwise, why would you do that?
They think that the case against him was stronger than they thought before. So what happens here is that these ladies make statements and then Chris Avellone sues them for libel. And the video that I did on my channel was about how difficult of a case that is to bring, because he isn't, in all likelihood, a public person. He isn't somebody that gets libel protection that requires actual malice. So it becomes a whole discussion of what exactly these people said, whether they knew it was false at the time, what their intents were. It's just a very difficult case to bring. And so I did a video on that. And then this news comes out and it appears to have settled. Now, he had been putting together medium posts and evidence that was going to be presented as part of his case in various places on the internet that you could follow and that he links to in the post that he did last week, that my best guess is suggested to the people involved that he was going to have a better time of it than they initially thought. This is all economics to me, right? So if you go and you look at law and economics, or you look at the study of any of this stuff, most civil cases settle because if we had perfect information, right? If everybody knew exactly what was going to happen, if we went through a trial or an arbitration or whatever it is that we did, and you knew for a fact that you were going to lose or that person was going to lose and you were going to win and this was going to be the damage award, then you would just do math, because lawyers are a deadweight cost, right? You just pay for them. You pay large amounts of money for them to arrive at that final decision. But if you knew that decision in advance, you would just settle for something slightly less than it would cost you, lawyers plus decision together. And so what you get is, as you get closer and closer to a trial date or an adjudication date of any kind, both parties have a better understanding of whether they think they're going to win or whether they're going to lose. And if you're rational, if you have rational actors on both sides, generally speaking, you settle because you can find a number in the middle that says, okay, I think this is going to be better off than me going through this whole process, spending all this money on lawyers and arriving at a loss anyway. So with this particular settlement, it does appear to me like the individuals in question that made the statements felt that the case was strong enough against them and that they risked enough money, because he, on the damages side, had a case that involved him being pulled from games and losing income, that they were that it was worth it to them to give him a settlement of X amount of dollars. Now, that dollar number wasn't released, so we don't know, because the higher that number is and closer to the damage request that he was making, the more we can kind of ascribe a percentage to what they thought their chances were. But we don't know that. It's still a big day for him. It's still what I would describe as a victory for him, insofar as they got the retraction that they wanted. He got a payday, but his career is still in a position where he doesn't have anything on the books that I know of. He used to be doing kind of the Kickstarter circuit, where he would be like a stretch goal for working on these games, because he was one of the few people I could say is a name in writing video games and RPGs. And that went away, as far as I know, completely. So will that recover? I don't know. But as far as the law goes here, it's not unusual to have a settlement. It is a little bit more unusual to have a settlement in a case like this, where it's a very difficult case to bring. Libel is a tough case to bring because the First Amendment and the right to speak is so important in the United States.
Yeah, I was so, I don't want to say impressed. I was so amazed by the thoroughness of what I would term his victory, of getting the statement, getting the explicit, because you would think people would be like, oh, I'll just pay you off. I guess this sucks. I mean, those women are probably going to have to declare bankruptcy, I assume. I don't think that, I wonder if Chris Avellone's ever going to see that money. But
yeah, I mean, they're probably not collectible, but
right. But their lives are basically ruined over this. And just, I don't know. I just didn't expect for that to pop up. Sometimes you read things in the paper It's like, oh, this was settled. This was settled for, an undisclosed sum. And that's the last you ever heard of it or something. But to have a statement of these women lying, and I went and did a little research on who these women were, and I just went on Moby Games actually to try to find them, and I didn't find either of them. So I don't know that they're even consequential members of the games industry. I would be loath to dig any further. I'm not trying to annoy anyone, although it would be interesting to talk to them. I doubt they ever would. But I did get in touch with Chris Avellone, and I think we are going to do a show together in the coming,
nice.
weeks or months. He's got his, he's got to kind of sort through his thing, but he and I were corresponding, and it's important that these cases are adjudicated properly if they go all the way forward, because the truth matters, man. I mean, and that's the case obviously in all legal matters, but the defamation, they ruined this dude. They fucking ruined him. And there has to be some sort of consequence. Is there any sort of legal, civil case is legal, but is there some sort of like felonious case that could be brought against them? It's not illegal, I guess, to lie to a journalist. So what do you do? Is there any other recourse? Like, I just feel like there's got to be a penalty for doing something like that. Like that's.
Well, the libel is the penalty, right? I mean, like the penalty.
So it's taken civilly only, right?
Yes. We don't, it's not illegal in general to lie.
Right.
That's one of those things that I talk about a lot, which is that comes across sometimes on the internet. It's illegal to lie. It is not.
Right. Like cops can lie to you, right? When they pull you over and stuff like that.
Sure. But I mean, just like in life, right?
Right.
You tell your spouse you have a late day at work and you go to the bar. It's not a criminal act. But when you're looking at these kinds of issues, you say, what can you do? You can bring a libel suit, which is what he did,
right?
Or a defamation suit in general, and you can have a settlement. So, or you could win your case. So that's really the protection. Most of the protections you have in business and in life in general are personal actions, private actions, civil actions, more than criminal, whether it's misdemeanor or felonies. And so, in answer to your question, yeah, I think you can have, like, if they had filed a report with the police that proved to be wrong, you can have a police report.
Then that's a lot. Right. Okay. Gotcha.
That's why in many of these instances that are later borne out to be false of some kind, you don't really have that police report. You look at like Johnny Depp and Amber Heard. One of the problems that she had in court was that she didn't have any reports for anything that she was claiming happened. And that's because most people are wise enough to know you don't escalate it to the authorities without really undertaking significant exposure risk for yourself.
Fair enough. Well, hopefully I'll have him on the show to talk about his story.
That'll be great.
Yeah, I think that would be really interesting. And I heard behind the scenes when all this stuff was going down a couple of years ago from people that worked with him being like, I don't believe this at all. So and I felt that way about other people that I've known have been accused of things too. I think people are just too flippant about, they were pretty explicit about what they were saying about him, but I think a lot of the gray area of implying things about people, and I just don't like when people lie and distort with really heinous consequences for the target. And so this is a win as far as I'm concerned. And shout out to Chris Avellone. Hopefully we'll talk to him soon. But Rick, I've taken up enough of your time. I really appreciate you sitting down and talking to me today. It was awesome to catch up with you again and do our usual shtick of me asking dumb questions and you correcting the record. So
no, I think it was fantastic. Thank you for having me.
No problem. And we'll have you back on for when you're back to playing. Actually, we might do something with Octopath. So maybe we'll have you on for that, but we'll definitely have you on with more of the games discussions. We had you on for the God of War one, which people really enjoyed.
Yeah, that was some of my most fun at the end of the year.
Yeah.
The other thing, not so much.
Right, exactly. But it's good to see you in improving health, my friend. We all have your back, and thanks again for your time. And thank you all out there for your love, kindness, and support of all things Sacred Symbols. Last Stand Media couldn't do without you. We'll see you next time. Until then, goodbye. Sacred Symbols, a PlayStation podcast, is a product and trademark of Last Stand Media and Collins Last Stand LLC, and is proudly recorded in the USA. The show is conceived by, is written by, and is directed by me, Colin Moriarty. My co-hosts are Chris Raygun Maldonado and Dustin Furman. The show is produced by executive producer Dustin Furman. It's edited by associate producer Ben Smith. All of Last Stand's theme music is by my best friend, Ramon Narvaez. As you know, all of Last Stand's shows, including Sacred Symbols, are fan-funded on Patreon at patreon.com/laststandmedia. The following names are at the producer level on Patreon, our highest tier, and we're grateful for your thoughtful and kind contributions to our independent endeavor. Thank you.